Hello and welcome back. I'm Patrick Machayo, and I want to thank you for tuning in to our ongoing conversation about governance in the United States, about democracy, and about the pressures shaping leadership in this moment. This is part of a broader discussion we've been building around how systems actually function, not just how they are supposed to function, especially now as we move closer to marking 250 years of American independence. Today, I want us to focus on Congress. More specifically, I want us to explore a question that many people are asking, even if they don't always say it directly. Does Congress still matter? And I think the answer is yes. But there is a condition attached to that answer. Congress still matters, but often only under pressure. Now let's unpack that, because it reveals something deeper about how American governance actually works. If you follow Congress closely, the dominant impression is one of gridlock. You see debates that stretch on for weeks without resolution. You see partisan divisions that feel impossible to bridge. You see issues that clearly matter to people, yet somehow they remain stuck. That frustration is real, and it reflects how Congress operates under normal conditions. But every so often, something breaks that pattern. Recently, in less than 10 days, 3 members of Congress resigned under the weight of ethics allegations. These were not routine exits. Each of them was facing the possibility of expulsion, which is an extraordinary measure in American political life. It has only been used a handful of times in the entire history of Congress. What makes this moment even more striking is that these cases came from both political parties. That tells us something important. This was not about partisan maneuvering, it was about pressure. Pressure from ethics investigations, pressure from media scrutiny, pressure from public perception, and ultimately pressure from the risk of institutional damage. When that pressure builds to a certain level, the calculation changes. Staying in office becomes more costly than leaving it. Now, this is not an isolated phenomenon. If you step back and look at Congress more broadly, you begin to see a pattern. Under normal conditions, Congress moves slowly. It debates, it delays, and it often avoids difficult decisions. But when the stakes rise high enough, the same institution can act with surprising speed. We have seen moments where Congress comes together, even in a deeply divided political environment, to pass critical legislation. We have seen votes that are unanimous. A 100-0 vote in today's Senate is not just rare, it is a signal. It tells us that when the cost of doing nothing becomes too high, action becomes unavoidable. Now, this is not ideal governance. Ideally, we would want a system that responds consistently, not just under extreme conditions. But this is real governance. Congress was never designed for speed. It was designed for negotiation, compromise, and representation across a very large and diverse country. That design creates stability, but it also creates friction. In today's political environment, that friction often looks like paralysis. But pressure changes that equation. To understand this, it helps to think about what an average day in Congress actually looks like. Most of the work is not visible. It happens in committee rooms, in policy drafts, in negotiations that the public rarely sees. Members are balancing competing interests, responding to constituents, and managing political risk. And that risk matters. In many situations, doing nothing is politically safer than doing something. Taking a strong position can create backlash. Compromise can be framed as weakness. Delay, on the other hand, can often be justified until something shifts. When voters begin to push harder, when media attention intensifies, and when an issue becomes impossible to ignore, The political calculus changes. What once felt safe becomes risky. What once seemed optional becomes urgent. At that point, action becomes the safer choice. This is why Congress can appear inconsistent. It is not that the institution suddenly develops new principles under pressure. It is that the cost of ignoring problems becomes greater than the cost of addressing them, and that distinction matters because it tells us something fundamental about democratic systems. They respond to incentives. They are shaped not only by rules and procedures, but by pressure from the outside. Congress holds enormous power. It controls federal spending, directing trillions of dollars toward public services and national priorities. It has oversight authority, allowing it to investigate the executive branch, hold hearings, and issue subpoenas. It passes the laws that define how crises are handled. That power does not disappear during periods of gridlock. What changes is how that power is used. When pressure is low, fragmentation dominates. Partisan divisions take over and progress slows. But when pressure rises, whether from economic concerns, public outrage, or institutional risk, the same body can shift. That shift is not perfect and it is not always enough, but it is real. And it raises an important question. How much pressure should it take for Congress to act? Because if the answer is that it takes a crisis, then the system is operating reactively. That creates frustration because people expect government to function as a baseline, not as a last resort. At the same time, there is another side to this. Pressure does not appear suddenly. It builds. It comes from citizens engaging with the system. It comes from journalists asking difficult questions. It comes from advocacy groups organizing and communities sustaining attention on issues that matter. These actions may seem small on their own, but together they shape the environment in which Congress operates. They create the conditions where inaction becomes more costly than action. And that is where influence lives. Congress does not operate in isolation. It responds to signals. Those signals come from voters, from the media, from the executive branch, and from the broader political environment. When those signals align, movement becomes possible. What we are seeing in moments like the recent resignations is not just a story about ethics violations. It is a reminder that pressure can override inertia. It shows that even in a system that often feels stuck, accountability can still emerge. But it also shows a limitation. Pressure-driven governance is not the same as consistent governance. It can produce action, but it does not always produce long-term solutions. It can resolve immediate problems without addressing deeper structural issues. Still, it tells us something essential. Congress still matters, not because it is always effective, but because when the stakes are high enough, it remains the place where decisions are made, where accountability is enforced, and where the direction of policy is determined. The challenge is that it often takes too much pressure to reach that point. That is where frustration comes from. People expect responsiveness as a baseline. Instead, they often see it as a reaction. But even that reaction is meaningful. It shows that the system is still capable of movement. It shows that incentives can shift. And it shows that engagement, even when it feels slow, still has the power to shape outcomes. The question going forward is whether that responsiveness can become more consistent, whether pressure can translate into earlier action, and whether the gap between expectation and delivery can be reduced. Because in the end, people do not evaluate government by intention. They evaluate it by experience. I'm Patrick Machayo, and I want to thank you for taking the time to engage with us in this ongoing conversation about governance, about America, and about the pressure on democracy, especially now as we approach the celebration of 250 years of independence. Thank you for listening.